This video is something a little bit different for this channel because it's not me, but my friend and colleague, John Paul Heil, who will be speaking in this video. A few months ago, John Paul gave a fun talk about Machiavelli and the concept of simulatio, deliberate deception, in politics. This was the annual Ducharme lecture at Mount St. Mary's University. He spoke in April of 2025. Dr. Heil has a PhD in history from the University of Chicago in 2022, and he now teaches as a core fellow at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland, where I teach. I interviewed him in episode 21 of my Life After Philosophy podcast. He was the historian. The title of his talk is How to Lie Virtuously, a Renaissance Guide to Deception in Politics. And for context, let me tell you that in the weeks before the lecture, John Paul sent emails out to people on campus promising to give away at least $100 in cash to somebody who attended the lecture. So here's his talk. I hope you enjoy it.
So let me begin by welcoming you to the Spring 2025 Ducharme Lecture. And let me say that it gives me very, very great joy to be able to introduce my colleague, my former student, and my friend, Dr. John Paul Heil, who will be speaking on the very provocatively titled How to Live Virtuously, a Renaissance Guide to Deception in Politics. That Professor Heil will speak to us on the Renaissance is particularly appropriate since it is not only his academic specialty. He did write his dissertation on the subject of virtue and vice in Renaissance Naples, but it is also appropriate because Professor Heil is very much and always has been what you would call a Renaissance man. And what that means is someone who takes on multiple interests and excels at them all and does so, as Renaissance Italians might have said, with sprezzatura. And by that, they would have meant that he does them so gracefully and so easily that he makes it all look very simple and very easy to do. Professor Heil, for instance, graduated from the Mount in 2015 with not one, but 3 majors in history, Italian studies, and philosophy. He received his MA in history at the University of Chicago in 2016 and his PhD in history from the University of Chicago in 2022. Along the way, his academic interests have been in the best spirit of the Renaissance, and I would also argue in the best spirit of the Mount, very, very widely varied. He's published and spoken on everything from magic in Renaissance Florence, to the literature of Wendell Berry and Jane Austen, to the theology of von Balthasar, to the labor market in higher education, to Ridley Scott movies, to the purpose of bookstores. It's also fitting that he speaks to us on the Renaissance because in the best spirit of the Renaissance, and I would also argue in the best spirit of the Mount, Professor Heil has read and loved the classics. And he's read and loved the classics not just as things that were written in the past or works that have come down to us, but rather as conversations, great and important conversations about what it means to live well in the present. So let us show our appreciation for Dr. Heil for welcoming us into that conversation now.
There's a lot of people here. Can you hear me? Yeah? People in the back? Feeling good? Dr. Mills? Woo! That's right. All right. Thanks for being here, everyone. It's good to see all of you. All right. It is such an honor to be here today, and I have so many people to thank. Thank you to Luis for leading today's prayer. Thank you to Robert Ducharme for being such an inspirational teacher to so many generations of the Mount students, including myself. Thank you to our dean, Brian Zygmunt, for his exceptional care, custody, and stewardship of the College of Liberal Arts, including our merch, which you can see represented right here. To Mary Lejeune and all the folks with AV and dining services who worked in the background to make today a success, to the president and the provost, and also to my mother, all of whom took time out of their busy schedules to be here on Jerry Fest Day. But I want to thank 2 very important figures who are here for just being tremendously good people. First, Greg Murray. Greg, you taught me how much joy history can bring to my life, and there is no way I would be even a quarter of the teacher or the person that I am without your mentorship. Folks, Greg Murry is a world-class scholar and mentor and teacher and colleague, and though he will never admit it, Greg keeps this place together. The mere fact that y'all were able to register for classes last week is due in large part to him. We are just so blessed to have him here. So thank you, Greg. And second, Rafael Delarada. Rafael, like Greg, is just really bad at tooting his own horn, but he has been one of the most outspoken advocates of the liberal arts this school has ever had. Rafael, I know that you're going to say that you've heard it enough, but you haven't. Thank you. Thank you for the academic center renovations. Thank you for our expanded study abroad programs. Thank you for this lecture series. And thank you most of all for giving me the opportunity to teach the classes that I've dreamed about teaching ever since I was a student here. You've made my life here possible and the pursuit of my professional vocation possible, and I am so grateful, and I will never be able to repay you. But at least I can applaud you, and I think we all can. Thank you both. So did you notice how I just tricked you? Because what I just did was something called simulatio. Simulatio is a rhetorical technique from the ancient world, and it's one of the easiest ways that a speaker can manipulate his audience into liking him. When a speaker knows he's going to be speaking in front of a large group of people who either don't know who he is or might be wary of him, maybe because he sent out an email saying he'd be handing out $100 in cash at this event, and his audience might think that it's a lie. If your audience is in doubt, it's really important that you get your audience over to your side as quickly as possible. So what are you supposed to do? Well, one of the things you can do is exaggerate, play things up, and especially play up how humble you are. When Cicero, who's arguably the greatest thinker in the ancient world when it comes to speaking well, writes about simulatio, he recommends that speech makers not only play up how grateful they are towards the politically important people, like say one of our university's biggest donors, but also to connect themselves quickly with someone the audience considers popular, like the guy who's arguably the most in-demand faculty member on this campus. But you don't have any idea how I actually feel about Dr. Murry on my insides. I could hate him. We could be beefing right now and you would have no idea. But that's not important. Because when I started the talk, I seemed to like him and seemed to be grateful towards him. And that image, that seeming, was more important for you in forming your first impression about me than what I actually am. The seeming was arguably more important than the being. Now that being said, don't get it twisted. Raphael, Greg, I love you guys, come on. But today we take it for granted that if you do any sort of work in the public sphere, particularly if you're elected to it, that you're going to have to lie. We treat the word politician as synonymous with the word liar. And if you paid attention during the Greece and Rome sections of your Origins of the West class, you'll know that politicians lying is not a new thing. Think Pericles or Tarquin or Tullia. But there's a big difference in how the ancient and medieval imagination thought about the role of lying in politics compared to us. We might not like it when politicians lie, but we assume that it comes with the job, that there's no way to be honest in politics. But for ancient and medieval political philosophers, the loss of truthfulness in politics was symptomatic of the failure of the state. They thought that a politician acting dishonestly would lead inevitably to the breakdown of the common good. And then about 530 years ago, Italian Renaissance scholars flipped this notion on its head. Maybe it's more important for people to seem faithful, charitable, wise, prudent, or just than to actually be those things. Maybe appearing virtuous is enough. Maybe lying itself could be a virtue. In enacting this moral revolution, these early modern scholars unwittingly paved the way for the skeptical crisis of modernity we observe in Philosophy 203, and laid out a political philosophy which aimed to serve, a political philosophy which served as the backbone for a lot of global education throughout, all the way until the 19th century. My aim today is to retrace the steps of one of these Renaissance thinkers, to reconstruct his arguments for the virtuousness of lying, and to determine whether deception truly has any role to play in the flourishing of the state or the individual according to the Catholic vision of the human person. So when I'm sitting and listening to a lecture, I like to know what the plan is, if only so I can chart out my bathroom breaks. So here's how we'll proceed. First, we're going to consider some key definitions, and then we'll zip through a quick history of the ethics of deception before we land in southern Italy in the Renaissance. We'll meet one figure in particular, Prime Minister Giovanni Pontano, and take a look at his guides for how to succeed in lying in politics, as well as the consequences his thought had for Europe over 4 centuries. And then we'll wrap up with some Q&A. And along the way, who knows? Maybe you'll make some money. Sound good? All right, let's charge ahead. Woo indeed. All right, let's talk terms. Let me begin with deception. Now, when I talk about deception here, I'm talking about when a person, through a conscious choice, chooses not to reveal the entirety of the truth to another person. One form of deception is a lie. The essence of lying, according to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, is when a person purposefully wills to tell another person something false, something that does not accord with reality, with the intent to mislead them as to the reality of things as they are. We're going to be focusing on 2 types of lying according to the Aristotelian tradition. 2 vicious extremes to the virtuous mean of truthfulness. Now, recently you read in Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in your Philosophy 103 classes, which is where he's outlining what the virtues are. And one of the ones he mentions is aletheia, which is the truthfulness, which manifests in speech as the accordance of your words with reality. Now, aletheia is opposed on one side by the quality of excess, which in Greek is alazoneia, but which you've already encountered in its Latin translation, simulatio. Simulatio means you're playing up or exaggerating the truth, or you're showing off and being ostentatious. You're overblowing some aspect of your personality or of reality. Now, faculty see this a lot around midterms and finals. Oh, Dr. Heil, I can't make it to the exam tomorrow. You see, my beloved grandmother, you don't understand. She raised me from when I was but a wee lad, and the tuberculosis has taken her lungs. She needs me by her side. Mightest thou not spare perhaps a crumb of mercy for me, your favorite student, Chad, from the baseball team? And then, of course, you find out that when Chad was taking Chem 101 last semester, his grandmother was on death's door every time he took an exam, and actually she's 6 years old and living happily in Bermuda. So that's simulatio. On the other side, you have a deficiency of truthfulness. That's dissimulatio, dissimulation, which comes from the Greek word ironeia. This is when you downplay the truth and try to make less of something than it is. You're really trying to undersell yourself or the situation. So this might mean false humility, or it might mean you trying to downplay some truly disastrous situation. And this is something that faculty also hear, especially when we have our advising meetings, when midterm grades are posted. Oh, Dr. Heil, mine own academic advisor, you must understand how totally surprised and taken aback I am to see that I have a D+ in philosophy. But surely this cannot be the case. My grade in the recent exam, it was not so bad. Well, for you see, Dr. Neighborhouse must have simply input the grade wrong, and it appears he did so for several of my quizzes. What? He told you I have 7 unexcused absences in this class? No, he must simply have forgotten that I was at a game at the time. Oh yes, did you forget that I, Chad, am on the baseball team? Oh, am I any good? Oh, I'm not so good. I only have a 280 batting average. Ah, ha, 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 ha. And then, of course, you touch base with Dr. Neighborhouse and you find out that Chad now has a D- in his class because he keeps showing up late and hungover from all the parties at the baseball house. Anyway, so to sum up, simulatio means that you are exaggerating the truth. You're saying, look at the glory, look at the thing that I'm doing, look at the glory of this thing as it is. And dissimulatio is, oh, I'm downplaying, all is well, I'm so humble, all is well. Okay. Now, you may have noticed that dissimulation's Greek root looks like another word that we have in English, that ironeia looks a lot like irony. When Greek philosophers talk about the quality of soul that comes when someone is downplaying his own intelligence, they would say that person is being ironic. One of the things that ancient Greek philosophy had to contend with from its beginning is that irony can sometimes be really, really useful, especially when you're trying to educate people. When you're really smart and you're trying to argue against someone else, if you play dumb and seem to be less intelligent than you are, you can lure your opponent into a false sense of security. you get them to underestimate you. This sort of irony is foundational to the Socratic method, and indeed Socrates is hailed by philosophers as being a brilliant ironist, a master dissimulator. But how are we supposed to square this with the fact that, at least according to Aristotle, dissimulation is supposed to be a vice rather than a virtue? Well, in the Republic Book 2, which you may have read earlier this semester, Socrates distinguishes between two types of deception. There's true falsehood, the ignorance in the soul of the one who has been deceived, which is neither useful to gods nor to men. But then there's a type of falsehood in our words, which, while detested by gods, is useful against our enemies, even those who are called our friends, whenever they contrive to do something harmful through madness or ignorance. That's when it becomes useful as a preventative, like medicine. In Book 3, Socrates argued that useful lies, which are a form of medicine, should be used by those who govern to benefit the state, but all the rest of society must avoid having anything to do with such a thing. One example of this sort of medicinal lie is the creation myth of Socrates' Republic, in which the founders of the city make up a story about how the Polis' gods separated out the citizens into a caste system. So from as early as Plato, we have this key qualification when it comes to deception. There are some lies which are just falsehoods, but there are other lies which are really, really useful, especially when people in political power deceive their populace for the sake of some greater common good, like social stability and peace within the body politic. Critically, Plato would not say that simulation and dissimulation are tools that can be used by everyone, only those who have legitimate authority over the state, the ruling class. As political philosophy develops, the people who are writing about the role of deception in politics tend to fall into one of two camps. On the one side, following Socrates and Plato, you have writers like Cicero, St. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and St. Jerome, all of whom support the idea of a medicinal lie. On the other side of the divide, you have thinkers who are much more wary about using deception in any circumstances. And just as the first group follows Plato, this tradition is a little more Aristotelian. Of the early church fathers, St. Augustine, or Augustine if you're nasty, takes the most inflexible stance towards deception. He writes 2 treatises online which are extremely influential and which firmly establish simulation and dissimulation as vices within the Christian tradition. He also provides a nice, simplified definition of how simulation and dissimulation are both forms of lying. In both cases, you have someone who says and does one thing on the outside, but thinks another thing on the inside. And this two-facedness is especially bad when you have someone who is trying to act like he's just and moral externally, but internally he's doing that for selfish or immoral reasons. St. Isidore of Seville builds this problem out in the centuries following Augustine and calls this sort of behavior hypocrisy. Augustine and Isidore's critiques of simulation and dissimulation are foundational for St. Thomas Aquinas' treatment of lying, which is, to absolutely no one's surprise, the most complex among medieval thinkers. Thomas follows Augustine very closely and even goes one step further than other writers in the Aristotelian group. He seems to suggest, in certain portions of the Summa, to criticize those who would use irony to entertain or teach. However, very curiously, he has this one mysterious passage in the Summa where he appears to soften towards dissimulation. He writes, "It is not lawful whatsoever to tell a lie for the sake of some greater good, like freeing another person from any danger. It is permitted, however, to conceal the truth prudently under some dissimulation," as Augustine says in Contra Mendacium. The problem is, when you go to Augustine's Contra Mendacium, you can't find a reference to prudent dissimulation anywhere. But what you do find is a lot of references to silence. When Augustine is talking about prudent dissimulation here, he's not talking about a downplaying of the truth, which would require some form of active deception, you trying to trick another person, but rather simply passing over something true in silence. Okay, my colleagues in the Center for Instructional Design and Delivery tell me that the average student's attention span can only last about 10 to 15 minutes before you start to zone out and totally lose track of what's going on. And that one of the things that can help recapture that attention is a modality shift, a change in the way that you present that information. So here's what we're gonna do. It's money time. You have on the screen a link. You can use your phones for this. You should use your phones for this. You have no other way to do it. There's a link on the screen, buzzonk.com. I know that buzzonk is a weird name, but so is Heil, so you're just gonna have to deal with it. Every 10 minutes or so for the rest of the lecture, I'm going to ask you all a set of 2 or 3 questions. There will be 7 total. And the first person to buzz in correctly after I read off the question will receive $20 in cash, which you can come pick up from me at the end of the lecture. Now make sure to change your name at the top of the screen to your real first and last name. I can't give $20 to Tinky Winky or to Barney. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to work this out, then I'm going to click forward. I will read off the question, and then I will say go. If you buzz in before I say go, doesn't count. I'm going to reset the buzzer. The first person to buzz in after I say go will get the 20. I mean, you have to stand up and you have to loudly proclaim the correct answer. Once you do that, you'll get your 20. We feel good? Feel great? Cool. Awesome. Alrighty. If you're having issues where it says waiting for host, check your URL because you probably misspelled it. But assuming that nobody has like totally crashed and burned and we haven't crashed this poor little guy's website, let's advance. Question 1. Dr. Murry comes up to me after this lecture and insists to me that he's not the most popular faculty member on campus. He tells me that he's sure that Dr. Fritz or Dr. Dudley or Dr. Mills are more popular than he is. However, deep down, Dr. Murry really does believe that he's the most popular faculty member on campus. He's just trying to appear humble. Dr. Murry is A, simulating, or B, dissimulating. Go. My gosh, there's so many. Okay. Maddie Koshansky. Yay, she got it right. Question 2. Socrates would have been totally cool with any citizen of the Republic lying for the sake of maintaining the health of the state. Oh, sorry. True or false? Go. Oh my gosh, so fast. Lorelei Paxton. Correct. Socrates would have said that's totally disordered. Well done, Maddie and Lorelei. Okie dokie. Let's talk about the Italian Renaissance. Italy, former seat of the Roman Empire, center of Mediterranean commerce and culture. Pretty great. You should go. In fact, you can go this fall with Dr. Toll's Florence class. Thank you so much, Mount St. Mary's Expanded Study Abroad Program. All right, how's Italy doing? Well, in the 1340s, less than 20 years after Dante writes the Divine Comedy, which is the final text we read in our Origins of the West class, Italy's kind of on fire. After the fall of the Roman Empire, things were really not great for our beloved Italian peninsula. It split apart into a million little duchies and republics and monarchies, all of which claimed to be the true successor to the Roman Empire. And of course, no one actually takes them seriously. But while these city-states are fighting each other to the death, the centers of intellectual and cultural production shift away from the Italian peninsula. In the east, Constantinople contends pretty accurately that the Roman Empire hasn't actually fallen for them, and that they're keeping it alive. The interplay between Christianity and Islam in the East ensures that Greek thinkers like Aristotle and the pre-Socratics aren't lost after the fall of Rome's intellectual infrastructure. In the West, the Holy Roman Empire, in modern-day Germany, is sponsoring scriptoria and the cathedral schooling systems to ensure that Rome's legal tradition isn't lost. In the later Middle Ages, the universities of Paris and Oxford are the places to study if you want a good career in politics or the law. France, there it is running laps around Italy culturally, especially around its artists and writers, with the construction of Notre Dame and Chartres Cathedral, and with the composition of the Roman de la Rose. By 1321, the year Dante finishes the comedy, Italy is being crushed on all fronts. Economically, culturally, politically, artistically, you name it, Italy is losing it. Then, as a cherry on top of the apocalyptic Sunday, in the late 1340s, the Black Death sweeps through Italy from the east, wiping out a third to a half of Italy's population. Italy is on the verge of destruction, and not just physically. One of Dante's contemporaries, a poet named Francesco Petrarch, is walking through the streets of Florence one day and realizes he's passed 4 or 5 bars. And the songs that he hears drunkenly being caroused out of these bars aren't Tuscan songs or Roman songs or Latin songs. They're French songs. On their off hours, in their spare time, when they're relaxing, Italians are preferring to speak French rather than their own local Italian dialects. And this really gets Petrarch angry. And so he starts writing letters to his friends and asking, how the heck did we get here? We used to rule the world. The world used to look up to us, and now we're a joke. Italy used to produce Ciceros and Caesars and Tacituses and Catos and Octavians, and now we don't even have our own songs, except for what Dante is writing. How did this happen? And Petrarch concludes that fundamentally this is an educational problem. The reason why Italy is failing is because it doesn't have any virtuous leaders that it can look up to. Leaders like Caesar or Cicero, because it's not educating its future rulers to be like those classical leaders. So Petrarch sends out a call. He gets in touch with every scholar, every lawyer, every priest he can get in touch with, and he asks them to check their family archives, to travel to monasteries and ask to see their libraries, to get in touch with merchants from the East to see if they're selling old books, because Petrarch's theory is this. If they can find, uncover, relocate those classical texts that taught Cicero and Caesar, and then start teaching Italy's future leaders with those same texts, if they provide them with an education based in the classics, they're going to produce a new generation of rulers that are going to be even better than those great historical figures they looked up to, because those new rulers will not only be classically educated, but they'll be Christian as well. And people love this. Petrarch's idea gains massive support throughout the Mediterranean. And over the course of a century, scholars go out to the most obscure libraries in the world and track down books that everyone thought had been lost with the fall of the Roman Empire, some of which only survive in single copies. But Petrarch also starts gaining support from princes, from the rich, from political leaders who are saying, hey, I'd like my kid to receive a classical education and grow up to be a virtuous ruler, and who send Petrarch and his followers a lot of money to begin reproducing whatever texts they find so they can start building out a curriculum, which comes to be known as the Studia Humanitatis. This is the root of modern liberal arts education. The humanities. The Mount exists. You are all here in this room because of Petrarch and his followers, whom scholars will later call Renaissance humanists. The biggest financial supporter of Renaissance humanism in the 1400s was Alfonso, the king of Aragon and Naples. Now, typically when we talk about the Renaissance, you'll hear about Florence and the Medici, or Venice and the Doges, or Rome and the popes, but you'll never hear about Naples. Even though, despite the fact that, as you can see, the Aragonese Empire extends through basically half of the Mediterranean. In the 1430s and 1440s, so this is after humanism's mission has been around for a little bit, Alfonso defeats the French, who had previously been the rulers of southern Italy, and he very quickly establishes himself as wanting to fit in on the Italian peninsula. And by this point, everybody who's anybody in Italy is sponsoring humanist scholars to work in their courts and teach their kids. So Alfonso goes, all right, y'all like humanism? I'm going to patronize the humanities so hard. You are going to have classical texts coming out of your ears. And he throws insane amounts of money at up-and-coming humanist scholars to try and establish his new kingdom of Naples as the place to be if you're a classical educator. Sounds pretty nice, right, faculty members? Yeah, pretty good. One of his earliest hires is a young man from central Italy named Giovanni Pontano. Pontano is extremely bright. He used to be young. This is after like 50 years of serving the state, so you got to give the guy some credit. I went bald. I hadn't even served the state at all. Pontano's really bright. He's read a lot of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and he's a true believer in the humanist mission. He really believes that classical education of Italy's elite is going to make them more virtuous. And that, in turn, is going to make the citizenry of Italy more virtuous. Like many other humanist followers of Aristotle, Pontano believes that a state is only stable when its populace is virtuous, and that ordinary people tend to learn virtue through mimesis, through imitation of others, and especially of their social superiors. like their princes. In fact, in his later years, Pontano, along with other Neapolitan humanists, will go so far as to argue that the moral character of a prince and the flourishing of his state are inseparable. If a prince is virtuous, his populace will see him act virtuously and will imitate those actions in their own lives. But if he's vicious, then his populace will likewise see and imitate him and become vicious themselves, and through the proliferation of vice, the state will fall apart. So it's really, really important that a prince be virtuous. But Pontano has also been thinking since his childhood about the difference between appearances and reality. He grows up in a town in central Italy called Cerreto, which is famous for one thing: fraud. Indeed, the word for the citizens of this town, Cerretani, is where we get our English word charlatan from, because Cerreto was famous for being the center of the counterfeit relic trade. Cerretani businessmen would sell off blood or wood or bone and say that it came from a saint or the true cross. So Pontano's got all these ideas in the background when he gets hired by Alfonso, and Alfonso, to his credit, isn't just sponsoring humanism so he can look good. He's not simulating being a supporter of classical education. He actually really enjoys reading the classic. He's a king who becomes notable for traveling with a library when he's out on military campaign and taking Pontano and other humanists with him so he can study in between battles. So for the first 11 years of Pontano's career in Naples, he loves it. He's getting paid really well, he's writing a bunch, he's tutoring the king's grandson, Alfonso II. Everything is going gangbusters. But then Alfonso dies, and his son Ferrante takes the throne. Now, one thing you gotta know about Ferrante is that he is crazy. How crazy he is depends on which sources you read. If you read Neapolitan sources, they simply frame him as being hard to work with. He's got a short temper, he's kind of a bully, constantly trying to blow off his kingly duties so he can go hunting. He's had a couple of humanist tutors growing up, but they quit because they didn't like working with him. That's one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum, you've got sources from from Germany and from France saying that Ferrante is a full-on supervillain. One particularly famous story talks about how Ferrante would invite his enemies to a luxurious dinner at one of his seaside villas, and after he wined and dined them and almost convinced them that he wasn't nuts, he'd take them down this winding staircase to a cave overlooking the sea. And his guests would see that this cave is filled with a second dinner party. And this is filled with all these guests, but they're all silent. And Ferrante's visitors go up to the guests in the cave and they realize, oh, these aren't guests. These are corpses that Ferrante has taxidermied and posed in fun positions so he can intimidate his enemies right before he kills them. And then he kills them, right? And the cycle begins anew. That's probably propaganda, but it should give you a sense of how popular Ferrante was versus his dad, just to say he really wasn't. It's money time. Okay. Second set of questions. Fingers on buzzers. It's so fun because I can see everybody like logging back in and also people trying to buzz in super quickly. It's great. I can also see the order you buzz in, which is really fun. All right. You ready for this? Question 3. Renaissance humanists aimed to recover classical texts so they could be used to educate future rulers to become virtuous. True or false? Go. I cannot believe this. The second person to buzz in was Lorelei Paxton, and the first person to buzz in was Maddie Kashansky. Maddie, would you like to tell us the answer? Yeah, that's right. Question 4. Please, guys, I can't have Maddie take like $80 of my money. I beg you. Question 4. Renaissance humanists contended that a state's citizens learned to become virtuous through mimesis, which means A, education. A is education. B is imitation. C, humanism. A go. I'm so sorry to whoever Laszlo is because you were number 2 and number 1 Lorelei Paxton. It is imitation. Applaud them. By the time Alfonso dies, Pontano has become one of the most respected humanists and diplomats in Italy. He's still a young guy, but he's important enough that Ferrante keeps him on as a tutor for his son, Alfonso II, even while he's laying off a bunch of other humanists so he can invest more money in hunting. Over the next 30 years or so, Pontano doesn't just become Ferrante's right-hand man, he becomes de facto leader of Naples. In 1487, Ferrante officially appoints Pontano as Naples' prime minister. But Ferrante is always the one in charge, and he's a constant pain in Pontano's neck. But even though Pontano and Ferrante are constantly at loggerheads, Pontano really wants Naples to succeed. And then in 1494, everything hits the fan. The recently elected Spanish Pope, Alexander VI, for those of you who are keeping track, gets in touch with Ferrante and encourages him to begin expanding his territory northwards into the Duchy of Milan. Milan does not like this, and in turn, they send a letter to the King of France asking him for help. And France says, well, of course we'll help. And then they march an army over the Alps and take Milan for themselves. And then the King of France remembers, well, wait a minute, don't I have a claim to the Kingdom of Naples? Didn't we used to rule that? Oh, wow, yeah, we did. And so he begins to march his army south and cut a swath through Italy. Naples knows that the French are closing in, but they've got problems of their own. You see, the Black Plague has come back and it's wiped out half of their population, and then it also kills Ferrante. So Alfonso II takes the throne, and Pontano is writing to him, and he's saying the whole time, like, you can do this, you've got this. You're a humanist, baby. Like, you can be so amazing. And then Alfonso abdicates the throne and runs away to a monastery. And the French roll in to the city gates, and they knock on the doors, and in one of the most embarrassing moments in Renaissance history, Pontano, being the only ranking state official, he's the guy with the keys to the city, so he's got to go let in this invading army of people who are here to destroy his city, everything he's worked for. But this ignominy is how Pontano ends his career as a politician and a teacher. But it's not the end of his career as a writer. For the remaining 8 years of his life, Pontano stays in his home in the Bay of Naples as Spain and France continue to fight a war over the kingdom, and he's sitting there and he's thinking about his life and about how he tried to be an honest prime minister and tried to suck it up whenever Ferrante attacked him, and tried to teach Alfonso II how to be a good and virtuous prince, and how it was all for nothing. And he thinks, screw it. And he writes 2 treatises, his 2 final works, the first on prudence and the second on the virtues and vices of speech, both of which are about simulation and dissimulation. At the beginning of these texts, Pontano is in a similar state as Boethius is in the Consolation of Philosophy. He's writing about how fortune can, in the blink of an eye, turn on you and destroy your life. But while Boethius ultimately sees fortune as something that can be only endured through recourse to the truth and to God, Pontano goes in the totally opposite direction. He writes how the customs which should be held by all good men have been made unbecoming. For in virtue nothing should be feigned, nothing simulated. Yet now and then so great is the strength of fortune, calamity, inconstancy, and the vicissitudes of human things that in some places and times it will be necessary to not only simulate, but also to dissimulate the truth into fiction. And the one who practices simulation and dissimulation well against fortune, Pontano says elsewhere, will be considered honestum, most exceptionally morally excellent, and indeed worthy of the highest praise. Pontano's argument here is that from the start, humanism made a mistake. It aimed its efforts at princes, at the elite. But who's to say that these princes will actually see the importance of keeping the body politic state safe, of ensuring that people who live their lives within it lead happy lives? Who's to say that these princes won't just spend the entirety of their lives hunting because they feel like it? No, instead it's all of us, all the citizens of a state who have a responsibility for its well-being. And that responsibility is the highest importance in our lives. It is our ultimate responsibility. Keep our safe and our fellow citizens safe. And we all have the duty to do whatever is necessary to achieve that, up to and including bending the truth, so long as we are deceiving to preserve the state. There's no sense here that the only form of dissimulation that is moral we can take as passing over something in silence. No, actively exaggerating and downplaying the truth for the sake of the state is totally morally praiseworthy. And he has tons of examples about this, including how Aeneas, in Book 1 of the Aeneid, purposefully simulates hope on his face, even though he truly believes that he and his Trojans are going to die, just so his fellow crewmates will see his fictive hope and imitate it. Pontano's final treatise on speech is basically just a list of exemplars of virtuous simulation and dissimulation. And he explicitly argues that any person, regardless of age, class, or gender, can be a virtuous dissimulator and therefore a prudent and virtuous person. He brings in examples ranging from St. Francis of Assisi to his own mother. But his exemplar par excellence is Socrates. But Pontano argues that Socrates doesn't go far enough. The medicinal lie is not something practiced primarily by politicians, says Pontano, but by doctors, who are not heads of state. Likewise, even priests, claims Pontano, often simulate or dissimulate to add authority to their preaching. In these cases, the ones practicing simulation and dissimulation well are not princes, but ordinary people. And when they exaggerate and downplay the truth, they are not doing so to harm the truth, but to serve it, to maintain it, by trying to make reality better than what it is. Like Aeneas, they are modeling a better version of the truth for others to imitate it. Now, Pontano knew what he was doing here. Scholars have widely acknowledged that he's the most careful student of Aristotle in the 15th century. And yet, in the last moments of his life, Pontano not only rejected the Aristotelian treatment of simulation and dissimulation, but went so far in the Platonic direction that he argued we need to go even further than Plato does. We need to democratize deception. But even though Pontano probably understood the break he was making with the history of philosophy, I strongly doubt that he understood the implications of his argument. But someone else did. Further north, on the Italian peninsula, another statesman was reading Pontano's work, Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, we know from Machiavelli's letters that he read Pontano, probably in small reading groups with other scholars. In the decade following Pontano's death, Machiavelli composed his short and controversial treatise, The Prince, which takes Pontano's arguments to places he never could have dreamed. In The Prince, Machiavelli talks a lot about virtù, which is not the same as virtue, but rather basically means this person has within them the strength to do whatever is necessary to achieve the goal he's trying to achieve. According to Machiavelli, a prince with virtù needs to be a great simulator and dissimulator, so as to not gain a reputation for dishonesty or treachery, even when he actually was being dishonest or treacherous. All men are capable of seeing, writes Machiavelli, but few of perceiving. All see what you seem to be, but few should perceive that which you are. Machiavelli takes Pontano's thesis and pushes it to its logical conclusion. If we follow Pontano's logic, then whoever simulates or dissimulates bends the truth for the sake of the common good, and that person is doing something morally excellent. So what's more important than reality, than the being of things as they are, is what we can make reality seem to be. Appearances are better than reality because they are more useful, and even though we have to bend the truth to get there, the end, the consequence, is worth it because it builds up the state. Well, Machiavelli takes that and he uses it as the core of a new political ethic, which 20th century philosopher G.E.M. Anscombe would call consequentialism. Consequentialism argues that what makes an action right or wrong is not the action itself, nor the circumstances of the action, but only the action's consequence. Consequentialism is sometimes described as the ends justifies the means, but for consequentialists like Machiavelli, the means really don't matter all that much. They're kind of irrelevant. You just need to do whatever is necessary to make whatever you want to happen, happen. That's what matters. And this seems pretty close to the ethic that Pontano is describing in his last two treatises, but he argues that the only consequence that we should be seeking when we simulate or dissimulate is the health of the state. Well, why should that be the case? Why shouldn't a cunning prince be allowed to simulate or dissimulate to get whatever sort of result he wants? This is in part the argument that Machiavelli is making in The Prince, especially in his famous passage in which he says that a prince has to be both like a fox and a lion. Because the fox, according to medieval bestiaries, is very skilled in simulating and dissimulating. But you can't just deceive people to get your way. because you also need to be like the lion. You need some muscle, some grit to be able to see your vision of the world through, to have the necessary arms and strength and virtù to impose your will onto others. Now, the prince ends up being condemned by the church before it's even published, which means that everyone in Europe is reading it. And in the decades that follow, Catholic political thinkers, particularly in the newly formed Society of Jesus or the Jesuits, are writing responses to Machiavelli, and they're examining the earlier Aristotelian Thomistic responses towards deception. They're thinking, well, actually, maybe Machiavelli's right about some stuff. The Jesuit-educated Justus Lipsius, one of the most widely read political theorists of the Counter-Reformation, argued in his Politica that there existed a kind of mixed prudence, the intermingling of virtue and trickery, cunning strategy which deviates from virtue or laws for the good of the king or the kingdom. Lipsius absolutely recommended dissimulation for the prince on the reasoning that in all your peoples you will find it hardly one who is trustworthy. A prince should be cautious and never reveal too much of himself. Lipsius argued that dissimulation was absolutely necessary for success in public life, for those who fool will never rule, and those who are entrusted with the whole well-being of the state can act in no other way. And thus, in order to bring their strategies to bear, many will have to simulate and dissimulate. A virtuous person who seeks to rule cannot trust the people around him. He has to deceive constantly. Another influential writer, the Jesuit professor Giovanni Botero, wrote in his text on the reason of state about the importance of the prince maintaining secrecy and downplaying his knowledge at all costs for the sake of the state's self-preservation, which is the highest goal and greatest moral end. Dissimulation was a critical instrument in a ruler's toolkit, as he must often have to pretend to not know or care about that which he does know or care about. In other words, though Machiavelli may have been officially censored by the church, the consequentialist logic he borrowed from Pontano sticks around, namely that appearances are more important than reality, and that deceptive actions are virtuous so long as they help the state flourish. But guys, fortunately, thank God, these ideas do not spread very far. Oh wait, did I say don't spread very far? Because what I actually mean was they become the backbone of Jesuit political education and spread to every corner of the globe. Jesuit missionaries formed in the later humanist tradition read Lipsius and Botero as part of their core studies, as well as the bits of Machiavelli filtered through these figures, and then they go abroad. And when they teach people about politics, they talk about how simulating and dissimulating for the sake of the state is perfectly moral and licit and virtuous. And what does for the sake of the state mean? Kind of up to the head of state, or the virtuous person who's trying to rule. And this tradition of political philosophy, this reason of state tradition, becomes something that every child in Europe who receives a Jesuit humanist education between the 1500s and the 1800s is exposed to as foundational for good governance. Figures who receive this education range all the way from René Descartes to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and include several key personalities, including Pierre Bayle and Descartes himself, who are responsible for the skeptical crisis in European thought that evacuates the human intellect of being able to find any sort of epistemological certainty in a reality beyond oneself. That's philosopher gobbledygook, so let me put that into simpler terms. Think about Descartes' arguments, right? Descartes argues, what if what I perceive reality to be is not in fact what it is? What if it's all appearances rather than reality? What can I be certain of? How do I know I'm not being tricked? Descartes' vision of the external world, that the world around us might simply be one of appearances, is precisely the vision of the universe we see Pontano beginning to develop and Machiavelli bring to its full fruition. Descartes is afraid he's living in a universe that is made up entirely of false appearances, and Pontano and Machiavelli and the reason of state tradition are arguing, stop worrying about realities. It's appearances that matter most, especially appearances for the sake of the state. I've talked for way too long. Let's give away some money. Final set of questions. Here we go. Y'all ready for this? Numbers are still going up. I'm just going to wait for the numbers to start. So, okay, they stop. No, they're still going up. Ah, they stop. All right. Question 5. What makes an action right or wrong according to consequentialism? A, the circumstances. B, the action itself. C, The consequence you get because of that action. Go. You're going to have to walk out of here with like an armed escort. You know that, right? Maddie? Yeah, sit down. All right. Yeah, you're right. You guys, yeah. Applaud. Thank you. It's great. You're done. You can't play anymore. Maddie, you're banned. Question 6. Based on what we've seen of consequentialism so far, the only person who can determine whether or not your action got the consequence you wanted is yourself. True or false? Go. Lorelei Paxton. Yeah, that's right. You're also banned from playing. Enough. Applaud her. Applaud her lightly and half-heartedly. All right. Buzzer's open for this question. Here we go. Final one. Question 7. I rigged these questions so that only 2 students would win. That way I could lure in a big crowd with the prospect of free money without actually having to give away any of my own money. From a consequentialist standpoint, have I done anything wrong? I sure haven't. Are you angry? Are you upset that I've cheated you? You should be angry. Just know that from a consequentialist standpoint, I am totally in the clear. Because you know what? I achieved the consequence that I wanted. I got a big crowd to come out and sit in front of my bosses. The guy who pays my salary is great. And this is a problem with the logic that holds up simulation and dissimulation as virtuous, as a good. Because that means the individual becomes the arbiter of truth. I decide when you get to hear the truth or not. I decide when you get to see reality and when you only get appearances. You and all human beings are simply a means to an end, an instrument so I can get my way and achieve the consequence I want to achieve. You are simply a tool so I can get what I want. And maybe what I want is the health of the body politic. But what is that? Who decides what that is? Well, if I'm smart enough and I'm strong enough, I do. That's how you deceive virtuously. All you have to do is make yourself the only person who decides what's real and what's not, what matters and what doesn't, what's virtuous and what isn't. Let's shift to Q&A. My gosh, this lady's really angry. What did you think? Is it on? Click the thingy till it's on.
Can you hear me now?
I sure can. Ma'am, what did you think of the talk?
Well, I've been taking notes, so.
Great.
Lying virtuously? You're a heretic! How I cannot believe an institution of Catholic higher learning would allow you, in one of its preeminent lectures, to give a talk on this load of garbage.
Applaud her. Woo her.
I'm not done. I'm not done.
I'm sorry.
I took notes.
Okay.
As you said, Aristotle says that virtue orients toward the good and toward human flourishing. But you deceived everybody in this room, and we're all mad. So you didn't achieve what you said, and you certainly denied our human dignity.
Okay.
So how can you say that that's oriented to the good or your own flourishing? That's not virtuous. You haven't told us how to lie virtuously. And also, second, you seem to conclude that virtuous deception is impossible, but you completely ignore Saint Thomas Aquinas when he talks about prudent dissimulation. How do you explain that? Well, I believe that your talk has failed miserably. You are a disgrace to the Ducharme lecture series, and you are a disgrace to this institution named after Our Lady. And I think for the next Ducharme lecture, you should just bring Professor McGinley back so he can talk to us about Tupac again. Thank you! Woo!
Well, Mother, thank you as always for your comments. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for taking off work, too. Okay, well, if I'm understanding you right, it sounds like you've identified two problems that are still on the table. The first is that, is it actually possible to tell a virtuous lie? And if it's not, how do we explain St. Thomas's assertion that some form of dissimulation is not only permissible, but virtuous and prudent? I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry to be a disappointment again. But it's basically impossible for me to answer these questions because in order to do so, there'd have to be some figure steeped in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition who, despite being extremely familiar with the reason of state tradition, would ultimately reject it as leading to a vicious lifestyle, and yet would also build out a definition of dissimulation which accords with prudence and virtue and would lead to human flourishing, and there's just no such thinker. Oh, I guess there is one. Let's talk about Jane Austen. As Alistair MacIntyre famously argues in After Virtue, Austen represents the last great writer of virtue in the West before the 20th century. Her novels are steeped in questions of the good, human flourishing, and what a life well lived looks like. But Austen's novels are also deeply obsessed with deception, and in particular with simulation and dissimulation. She was doubtless familiar with the reason of state tradition and the discourse in Christian political theory that emerges as a response to Machiavelli. Based on reconstructions of the library of Austen's brother, Jane kept copies of her novels directly catty-cornered to copies of Justus Lipsius. Across her novels, Austen engages with the philosophical discourse around deception's morality by condemning simulation as deeply immoral and by redefining dissimulation in a virtuous way as restraining one's tongue and doing good in silence without drawing attention to oneself, which is extremely close to the content in Augustine's writings, which Aquinas calls prudent dissimulation. Though we can see this as early as Sense and Sensibility, it's not until Pride and Prejudice that we really get to see Austen's distaste for simulation and praise of distaste for simulation and praise of virtuous dissimulation. Is that? Yeah, whatever. We'll just keep going. Both of Elizabeth Bennet's false romantic leads, Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham, simulate constantly. Mr. Collins is always boastfully playing up his connections with his beloved Lady Catherine de Bourgh and droning on and on ostentatiously about the glory of her estate and how the glazing of her windows costs upwards of £20,000. But while we're clearly meant to find Collins's obsequiousness and flattery annoying, Austen doesn't want us to treat simulation like a joke. Early in the novel, Mr. Wickham tells Elizabeth an account of his dealings with Mr. Darcy that slanders him by exaggerating some elements of the truth and purposely leaving out others, including the fact that Wickham tried to elope with Darcy's underage sister. Critically, Wickham appears to believe his own BS. His final conversation with Elizabeth has him make an awkward pass at her before attempting to resurrect his old stop stories about Darcy's injustices, before Elizabeth shuts him down once and for all. But Wickham, in true sociopathic fashion, really does seem to believe that he's the victim here, and that none of the evils he has done are his fault or even evils at all. The simulation of Collins and Wickham strongly contrasts the prudent dissimulating silence of Darcy. Look at him, he's so dreamy. Even though Darcy cares for Elizabeth, when he observes Wickham's early flirtations with her, he chooses not to reveal Wickham's vicious behavior towards his family because he doesn't want to besmirch Wickham's name. Though Darcy second guesses this later on, both Jane and Elizabeth conclude that Darcy did the right thing. But most revealingly, the novel's climactic heroic action from Darcy is one he performs off-page, in total silence. When Wickham suddenly and scandalously disappears with Lydia, potentially bringing disgrace to the entire Bennet family, Darcy hears the news and departs from Elizabeth's company with such abrupt silence that Elizabeth initially believes that he is ashamed and cutting ties with her forever. But what he is in fact doing is traveling to town in secret so he can hunt down Wickham and Lydia and prevent them from ruining the Bennets' good name. He pays off Wickham's gambling debts and arranges for the couple to wed quickly so scandal can be averted. Even though Darcy later admits he did all of this out of love for Elizabeth, he refuses to tell her that he's responsible, instead passing off all credit to Elizabeth's uncle. Elizabeth only finds out about Darcy's heroism when Lydia accidentally lets Darcy's involvement slip, even though she was sworn to secrecy. Darcy acts in total silence to pursue a good which he goes out of his way to ensure no one will know he's responsible for, simply out of love for another person. This is exactly the kind of dissimulation that Austen is extolling. Is it deception? Sort of. Darcy is seeking to prevent everyone from fully knowing the truth so that the Bennets don't feel beholden to him, and so Elizabeth doesn't feel like he's blackmailing her into loving him, which is prudent. But that being said, Darcy doesn't prevent anyone from finding out the truth by lying to them. He doesn't purposefully will to tell another person something false. He simply permits the full truth of his involvement from being revealed until Lydia spills the beans. I think that in laying out this notion of prudent dissimulation in Pride and Prejudice, this account of doing good in silence that is so rooted in the Augustinian and Thomistic traditions, Austen is showing us concretely how we can live out the gospel. Pontano might argue that it's possible for us to lie virtuously, but I've argued that this perspective ultimately collapses into the incoherence of consequentialism. But I do think that Austen points us towards perhaps the only way we can downplay the truth virtuously, and that's the path that Jesus points us towards in Matthew 6, which is one of the foundational gospel texts for the Lenten season we're currently in. Here Jesus states clearly, "Take care not to perform righteous deeds in order that people may see them. Otherwise you will have no recompense from your heavenly Father. When you give alms, do not blow a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets to win the praise of others. Amen, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right is doing, so that your almsgiving may be secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on street corners so that others may see them. Amen, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go to the inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will repay you." Know that Christ here explicitly condemns both simulators and dissimulators in the vicious Aristotelian sense. The first set of hypocrites blows the trumpet of ostentatiousness and pride before them, while the second set of hypocrites stand on the street corner and pray to try and project an image of false humility so that others will see and respect them. Rather, when we do good, we should do it in secret and not let our left hand know what our right hand is doing. As Austen so clearly shows, even those closest to us should not know the extent of the good we seek to do for them and for all those around us. So here's my homework for you. I'm landing the plane. If you remember nothing else from this lecture, this should be your concrete takeaway. It's my final pop quiz question for the evening. And by the way, speaking of which, I was keeping track of the people who actually buzzed in for each question. So Nolan Williams, Laszlo, Abby J, Johnny, and Anna Dang, if you can come and see me afterwards, and I will give you your money. It was real all along. Okay, here's the question. It's more of a challenge. I want you to do one thing by midnight tonight that concretely improves the life of at least one person you know here on this campus. And I want you to do it in total secrecy. I don't care what it is. Maybe it's emptying out the trash bins in the Mac lounges that are constantly full because they're teeny tiny, nobody wants to walk all the way up to the garbage chute and dump them out. Maybe it's going and offering up a rosary in the chapel for a classmate you know is struggling. Whatever it is, go do it. And don't tell anyone but God. Is that a virtuous lie for the sake of building up the body politic? Heck no. It's something infinitely, unfathomably better. It's living out the gospel. Thank you so much. That is for real the end of my talk.